spent about 5 days in Montreal and came to know the missionaries very well. And the things that we were told, of course, were very personal and very confidential. We did make a report back to the Central Council, and we felt we had come to know the problem, but they did not want to tackle the problem for whatever reasons, and so nothing was ever done to remove the problem. I can't remember the sequence of my many other visits, but I can tell you something about each one of them. On an unofficial level, I visited in Switzerland and Luxembourg and even in France. Very often, for the sake of economy, I went by Icelandic Air, which stopped overnight in Iceland and then went on and landed really in Luxembourg the following morning. It was, I enjoyed Iceland very much. It was very different. Even the food was different. The whole attitude was different. And I also enjoyed coming to know the people in Luxembourg and certainly the ones in Switzerland. There was only one missionary in Luxembourg. There still is only one in Luxembourg, but she's a very fine person. She is a school teacher. Perhaps by now she has retired. I don't really know, although I think she was younger than I am. I went to Yugoslavia one December to be there for their retreat. That was a very interesting visit. It was during the time that Yugoslavia was under the commies, and the Italians were restricted not by Italy but by the country of Yugoslavia itself from visiting there because they didn't want too much influence from the church. So it was very easy to send me over there, and I went with Elizabeth Peter. The two of us went together. I was told not to get a visa here in the United States, but to wait until I got into Zagreb, and then I would have to go to the head of the airport, and they would give me a visa. The Italians also told me that I could tell by the size of the red star on the cap of the man who interviewed me just how high up he was in the Communist Party. And I think I had a pretty high guy as far as the country of Yugoslavia was concerned. But when he saw that I had a return ticket, he gave me a visa without any problem. And then I was told that if I walked outside the airport, I would recognize the person who was waiting for me. And I did. It was a Franciscan friar whom I knew quite well. And it was a beautiful evening when I arrived in Zagreb. Very cold, early December, and it was snowing. And the snow coming down against the lights made a very beautiful scene. I've always remembered it. I stayed overnight with a group of sisters, and they very proudly told me that their previous guest had been Cardinal Spellman. I'm not sure whether I slept in his bed or not, but it was a very comfortable night. We did a little bit of sightseeing with one or two of the Yugoslavian missionaries, and then the following morning we started out to go down to the coast where we were going to make this annual retreat and have our ceremonies and everything. It was like a fairyland when we left Zagreb because the rain had turned to ice and the snow had turned to ice, and it was all over the trees, and it just looked like a fairyland. I'm sure for the people who were not in a car, it was very cold, but we were comfortable. When we got down to this shore, here again we stayed with a group of sisters for this retreat. There wasn't much heat, and I was to have a bedroom that had some heat in it. Well, I wouldn't take it because one of the missionaries was not well, and I felt she should have the room that was heated. So I went upstairs on the third floor with some of the others, and it was an education going down in the morning with a pitcher to get the water that was lukewarm on the first floor, but by the time you got to the third, it was a little bit chilly. And it took me one morning to decide how to do this with that same little pitcher of water, because the first morning I ended up with nothing with which to brush my teeth. But after that, I learned how to do it, and there was no problem at all. One of the great things that I thought about was you were awakened every morning with a liqueur. And I soon realized that that's how you got your blood flowing through your veins in the morning. You were cold enough in the morning that you took this nice little glass of liqueur, and before you knew it, you were just nice, toasty, and warm. I had to use my very poor Italian to talk with the missionaries, particularly with Father Soya, who was their ecclesiastical assistant. But we had a very fine retreat, and I was going to leave from Zagreb. No, I wasn't. I was going to leave from Trieste, I'm sorry. So we were to drive up to Trieste, and they were going to drop me. Well, of course, that meant crossing the line into the country of Italy. And it was very, very interesting to watch the young missionaries as we approached the border. One of them became quite distraught and said she had forgotten to leave her money at home. And I offered to take her money, but they said no, that even though I had an American passport and they wouldn't disturb me at all, they wouldn't, she wouldn't want me to have the money because I wouldn't be able to give it back to her. So then I watched her, and she had one of these small packages of Kleenex. She unwrapped that and stuck the money in there and put it back together again as if it had never been opened. And I was really very much impressed. They were lovely young women, and I learned how they lived their missionary life. I learned the problems that they had, and I came away with tremendous admiration for each and every one of them. One of their brightest young ones, her parents were both school teachers, but they were both unemployed because they had not been willing to give up their faith and take a communist card, and so they could not be employed. It was hard for them to get along, but they did manage. So to talk with these people and see how they made the best of what they had was, to me, very, very interesting. Then I went to Poland one time. This was by invitation, but it was not official as far as being sent by the Central Council. The woman who was the group leader in Poland is a cardiologist, a very fine young woman. And I remember her telling me that when she wrote and invited me, that you have to do the things you need to do, and you cannot be afraid. Once they find out that you're afraid, then they have you licked. So if you want to invite company, you have to do it. She always used a postcard so that any Polish mailman could read everything that was on it and realize there was nothing there that was subversive. For several years after the visit, we enrolled her in the American Medical Association and sent her the journal from the cardiologist so that she would have the most up-to-date knowledge. She lived with her mother and aunt just outside of Gdansk, and when she invited us to dinner one noon, but when we got fairly close, she said, "Now I will go on ahead," and she told us how to get into her apartment house and how many flights of stairs to walk up, and that when we knocked on the door, she would answer, but she did not want to be seen coming in with us because too many questions would be raised. Polish missionaries took such good care of us. Well, there were 4 or 5 of us. I know that Emma was one and Joyce was one. And we had really a wonderful time, and they shared so many things with us. We spent one night at a country parish. The pastor of this parish, his sister is a missionary. He was never allowed to leave this country parish, and certainly never allowed to leave the country of Poland while the commies were in charge, because he insisted upon allowing the lay people to come together, and he had many activities within his country parish. So he was, this is the way he was disciplined, by not being permitted to go out of the country. And one thing that I didn't tell you about the Yugoslavs, this one night, it was about 10 o'clock, and there were a lot of people on the street, and I said something about we would be afraid here in the United States to go out at that hour, and certainly to go out by ourselves. And Father Soyat said, well, you'd never get robbed or anything around here, because the penalties are so great. You could lose a hand, you could lose anything up to your life, so that nobody would rob you. You're perfectly safe. I wanted to buy some of their native jewelry, which was really lovely, and it was sold on the street. So Father Soyat offered to buy it for me, and he asked me if I could, that he would buy it, but could I repay him in American money, in dollars? And I said, yes, I could, and I would. And he said, you know, our currency isn't worth anything outside, beyond our borders. So I don't, I never even have any money with which to buy a religious journal or anything like that. And if I had some dollars, I could buy some books. So needless to say, I saw that he had enough dollars after he bought the jewelry for me that he would be able to buy some books. Every place we went, we were taken by a different set of missionaries. When we went to Czestochowa, where the Black Madonna is, we stayed with some sisters in their convent. It was in June, and it was quite hot, and yet when that Mass was offered in the convent, they closed all the windows so that nobody outside would know what was going on. They gave us some photos, and I still have them, showing how some of their sisters were killed and put into a deep pit, into a mass grave, and the others are standing there looking at this. It was rather a chilling experience. We went from Czestochowa to Krakow and then to Warsaw, and we did leave from Warsaw. But we got up at the crack of dawn in Krakow to take the train to Warsaw, because the newly renovated old town, see, it was all destroyed during the war, but from the ancient plans, they could reconstruct it with the same sort of bricks and everything. And these very important buildings were to be open to the public on that day. Well, we got on the train, and the next thing we knew, we stopped in the middle of somebody's cornfield, and we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there. And so that we managed to get to Warsaw too late to get the reservations which had been made for us. They'd been given away to somebody else. But through the underground, we were told that we could spend the night in the apartment of this doctor and his wife. They were both good Catholics and very active in their parish, and so on. But then we were told that we had to go in the back door of this mammoth apartment house, and we had to be very, very quiet, because the doctor did not have permission from the state to have company. And if anybody knew that the company was there, it could be very hard on the doctor. Well, you can imagine our surprise when we learned that one of the things was we could not flush the toilet all night long, because somebody else would have heard it, and they would have known that we were there, and we had to walk very quietly in our stocking feet. It was a very interesting experience, but I was never so glad to get out into the open air the following morning and go directly to the airport. And as Emma said, she realized then why John Paul II kissed the ground when he got off the plane. When we got back to Rome, she was going to get to kiss the Roman ground as she got off the plane, because we came to understand in a very real way what the lack of freedom really means. Because we Americans speak English, whether it's American English or English, we had many opportunities. For instance, when Brazil first became interested in the Institute, the friars in Brazil, except for the native friars, were from Holy Name Province, which was Father Stephen's province, and many of the friars had had Father Stephen in scripture class. One of them, who worked with what was then the Third Order and was very active in Brazil, remembered Father telling something about the Institute. He didn't exactly remember the name, and his memory was not so good, but he did remember that. So when he found within his Third Order groups some young women who were interested in truly dedicating their lives to God, and they still wanted to be Franciscans, he wrote to Father Stephen and asked him about this institute. And with the permission of the Central Council, we sent the rule and the Constitution, and one of the American friars translated both of those documents into Portuguese for the Brazilian missionaries. And then the Central Council asked me to go down to be with them for one of their very early annual retreats. They live on the other side of the, well, what do they live on the other side of? Their summer is our winter, so they had their retreat in what was the beginning of their summer, in other words, not too long after Christmas. And it was very interesting to be there and to hear the familiar Christmas carols being sung in Portuguese when the temperature was so hot you could hardly stand it. Katie Atwater went with me, and we stopped off in Rio for several days, managed to see some of the beautiful dances, and take several touristy trips in and around Rio. And then we went up to Annapolis, where we were met by the Franciscan friars and taken down to Annapolis, where the Institute was going to make its retreat. And at that time, there were these 3 or 4 young Brazilian women who were interested in the Institute. And then there was a larger group of Italian missionaries who had come over to do real missionary work in Brazil. They were not together at this point. Eventually they did become one, but at that moment it was considered better for the Brazilians to start out as Brazilians and not be influenced in an untoward way by the missionaries from Italy. But they made their retreat together, so I came to know them all. And it was really a very interesting and a tremendously enlightening experience. These missionaries were very young. I think even today, Brazil probably has the youngest in age group of missionaries of any place in the on the planet, really. The priest who gave the retreat was quite an activist, and I came to know from him how these people had to work in order to try to effect any great reforms within the country of Brazil. The missionaries there, here again, Brazil is a poor country. Many of them were what we might consider downtrodden. They didn't have much as far as consumer goods were concerned, but they certainly had a beautiful hospitality and a great spirit. And they have grown, and grown very admirably, I believe. In fact, they have now built their own retreat center, which they call the Borelli Center. And when it was dedicated, I was invited, but I did not go. But several other people, including the general ecclesiastical assistant from Rome, went for the occasion, and it was a very lovely occasion. Our present central president, Augustina Marchetti Dori, when she retired from teaching, gave 5 years of her life to do missionary work in the area of Bahia in Brazil. And so she has a very soft spot in her heart for the Brazilians. They have grown beautifully, and they are really basically all young missionaries. I went to the Philippines several times, and on one of these trips I took Nancy Fischelli with me. It was always good to have someone else with you, and certainly the person who accompanied me, was her transportation and so on was an individual matter. The Central Council did not pay her expenses, but she learned a lot about the Institute, as did I. The Philippines, too, are a young group of missionaries, and they all came from the Third Order. They were very active in the Third Order. One of the reasons that they were so active in the Third Order was that during the time of Marcos, there could not be any new religious groups beginning. Therefore, the existence of the Institute was always a very private matter, and they relied very heavily on their membership in the Third Order to use it as a front and a cover-up. We had a very interesting time with the Institute when it began in the Philippines. Father Mel Brady from the Cincinnati province of Friars was a missionary in the Philippines, and here again, because of the connection of English and his knowing Father Stephen and so on, he wrote to us and asked for information about the Institute. He began with one missionary, and in 1970, when she was ready to make profession, we paid her expenses to come over to the United States and make her profession with with all of us. And she spent any number of weeks here in the United States with us, and we came to know her very well. Her name was Concepcion. She was not a professional person, but she was an extremely charitable person, and she worked in the barrios of Manila. And she died of cancer within several years after making her profession, and I believe that she was the seed from which all the other missionaries came. The second missionary also had very poor health after a few years within the Institute, and she, after my second visit there, she was really bedridden, and here again, I think through her suffering and that of Concepcion, the seed for a very strong missionary group was formed. The faith of the Filipinos is beautiful. It's unshakable, I think. I can compare them with the faith of the Polish missionaries, and I think perhaps we can see where suffering does strengthen that gift of faith. I don't believe I've ever had the opportunity to receive communion during Mass and to realize the depth of the faith of the missionaries around me as I did in Poland. Even the silence in the room had a tone to it that was different from any other silence I have ever experienced. And then Nancy and I went on to Japan, and we stopped en route in Taiwan. A friar a Taiwanese friar who had studied at Hoining Province, was our host during our trip to Taiwan. He was interested in the Institute, but nothing really ever came of that. In Japan, the Institute had been there for some years before I went to visit. It was started by a Canadian friar, Father John Baptist Lacroix, who came back to Canada and then down to the United States to visit us when the Institute first began. And he really wanted the Japanese missionaries to come and live with us in the United States while they were probans and aspirants before their profession. Gemelli was ready to grant him this permission, and I was 100% against it, because I said most any foreigner who comes and stays with us in the United States for several years does not want to go back. And we really want these Japanese missionaries to be Japanese missionaries. So when he talked to Father Gemelli about it, Gemelli agreed with me, and therefore the Japanese missionaries never came to stay. But we always were very, very close. And their first missionary, Unisuka, is the one who gave me the picture of the Japanese Madonna that we now have hanging in our present headquarters in Maryland. Her brother was the doctor who was in Nagasaki at the time that we dropped the atom bomb, and he chronicled his situation once the bomb had struck, and so you knew exactly the physical problems that he was having. He himself suffered from the effects of the atomic bomb and died not too many years after I came to know her. She was a wonderful woman, and the Japanese do owe her a very great debt of thanks for the work that she did in getting the Institute off the ground. Most of these Japanese missionaries were pagans before they became Catholic, and so they had to vie with their paganism and their pagan families, and living in a culture where it was not a great thing to remain single. Everybody got married and had a family, and so they had much to overcome, and they did a very fine job in solving the problems of their own environment. We stayed with a missionary who had a lovely house and a Western bathroom, and that was indeed a very fine thing. However, this Western bathroom did not have what we would call a tub, at least not a stationary one, but one day she said to us, "I think you should take a bath." So she fixed the water, and because I was senior, I got to take the bath first, and then Nancy got in, and she took the bath, and we always laughed about how the water had changed colors between the two different baths. I'm not sure how much of the rest of my story I'm going to be able to tell on this tape, because I'm almost out of it. So I think maybe I'll leave the rest of the story of our Japanese trip and then of Australia and New Zealand and some of those things for another time.